So today I want to talk a little bit about panoramic photography, specifically how to stitch seamless multi-row panoramic images every time you shoot. Now, panoramic photography has gotten really simple over the years. We can all take pretty good shots using our iPhones or mobile devices, or even in our camera's auto stitch mode. These are very low resolution files, and if you happen to zoom in on pixel level, you'll notice that things don't always align correctly. Sometimes there's some overlap that doesn't work, sometimes the horizon jumps from piece to piece, and sometimes there's ghosted objects in the scene. So we're going to do it the right way. Now, talking a little bit about the gear setup that I have now, this is a Really Right Stuff TVC33 tripod. It's an extremely stable tripod. On top of that, I have a BH55 ball head, which is the most stable ball head they make. In addition to the tripod and ball head combo, I have a leveling base. Now, a leveling base works really great with panoramic images because right now I have a really level surface to work on. But if I had a slant to my surface, it's very difficult to level just the tripod. What a leveling base does is it adds an extra ability to do very precise leveling on the fly. So if I can't quite get the tripod perfectly level the first time, I can use this to precisely level everything. And this is going to be crucial to getting seamless panoramic images. So with a basic setup like this, even without the leveling base, you can still do basic panoramic images. So let's say, for example, I wanted to do a simple pano with the camera in vertical mode. Now I have an L plate on my camera, so I can hot swap it between vertical and horizontal compositions. For panoramic images that go left to right or right to left, I like to have everything in vertical mode because you actually get more on the frame from the top and bottom. Then when you overlap, you end up with a really nice wide scene that still has a lot of room on the top and the bottom for cropping. Now, if I was going to do a basic panorama in this fashion, I'd make sure that everything was level, perfectly level in the horizon, and I'd actually use the adjustment on the tripod to spin it from side to side, taking photos along the way. Good rule of thumb is to use a third overlap on your images. Sometimes you can use a quarter or a third to make sure that you have enough image for it to stitch it together in post. Now, the biggest problem with a setup like this is it doesn't solve the parallax problem. Now, what happens with parallax is objects that are closer to the camera will move faster as the camera moves, and objects further away will move slower. You can easily see this effect when you move side to side and the rate at which different objects move at different speeds. Similarly, when you're driving in a car, things that are close to you are zipping by, but the horizon in the background or the stars or the sun, that all seems to stay static. Now, when you're stitching images together and there's a lot of parallax in your scene, the software won't be able to find a blending point because things actually change shape as the camera is moving. So we need a slightly more complicated setup to solve the parallax issue. So while this solution may work if you're only shooting a distant landscape that's all on the same plane, it's not going to work if we have a lot of objects close, mid, and far away from the camera. So my solution to create seamless panoramic images every time is to use a pano gimbal head and nodal slide combo. This particular model is made by Really Right Stuff. It's a PG02 pano gimbal head and a long nodal slide. Now, what this allows me to do is get multi-row pano images that stitch seamlessly every time. The reason this works so seamlessly is you can calculate the no parallax point for each lens that you have. When you calculate the no parallax point, it means that there'll be no motion between your foreground elements and your background elements, so every image that you capture will stitch seamlessly in post. This may sound really complicated, but I'm going to show you how to calculate the zero parallax point for your lens, and you'll see just how easy it is. So first of all, if you don't have a leveling base, this will attach directly to the top of your ball head, and it'll clip right in securely. Now, I have something a little bit different. On the top of my leveling base, I actually have a quick release lever. So instead of using this ball head, I'm going to remove the ball head first. And I'm going to clip the gimbal directly to the leveling base. Now, since I can use this leveling base to level the tripod perfectly, I don't need the ball head. So what I'm doing right now is I'm looking at the built-in level on the leveling base to make sure it's perfectly aligned in the center. The other thing that's nice, this has a second level here out on the gimbal arm. That's a double indication that you're perfectly level throughout. Once the gimbal is attached, this is a nodal slide. This attaches directly to the L plate of the camera. So this nodal slide is a little bit long. You can see that it ends just at the tip of the lens here. Now, the nodal point is going to be really close to the front of the lens, so it's important that this is long enough to calculate it. If you have a smaller camera, like a mirrorless camera like this Fuji X-T1, you can actually use a smaller nodal slide. Now, if I were to use this big nodal slide on this smaller camera lens, since it exceeds the front of the lens too far, shooting at wide angles, there might be a chance that I could see part of the nodal slide in my shot. So you really don't need a nodal slide that's longer than the front of your lens. So at the very core of this, the functionality is the nodal slide attaches to the pano gimbal, and it allows me to independently adjust the rotation for the panorama and the elevation, so I can stitch multi-row panoramas together, or I can just stitch a single row by going with one, a double row by just raising it up and shooting an additional set. So now that all the gear's set up, I'm going to take the first steps into calibrating this. The first thing that I want to do is adjust the camera to look straight down. In dead center of my gimbal head, just above the base of my tripod, is some crosshairs. The first thing that I need to do is align the camera so that it's perfectly centered with these crosshairs. So the first thing that I'm going to do is enter into my camera's live view mode, and I'm going to point the camera straight down. I'm also going to make sure that the focusing icon, that little square, is dead center of my screen. Next thing that I'm going to do is actually slide this piece here, until that target is perfectly aligned with the center of my camera. So now that I've adjusted the camera's center point, now let's calculate the no parallax zone. So in order to calculate the 0 parallax point, I'm going to have to do something a little bit different. As I rotate the camera around, I'm going to need points of reference, both close and a medium length away from the camera, so I can determine at what speed objects are moving independent of each other. As soon as I can lock down and keep it so those objects don't move independent of each other, then I know I've calculated and found the 0 parallax point for this lens. Now, fixed lenses work really good for panoramic photography because 24 millimeter and 50 millimeter primes are always going to be the same reading on this nodal slide. This is the 16 to 35, so what I'm going to have to do is calculate the no parallax point for each focal length here that I'm planning to use in my panoramic photography. The process is going to be exactly the same, but it's going to change depending on where this lens element tends to fall on the zoom. So for this tutorial, we're going to calculate the 0 parallax point at 24 millimeter. Now, since I shoot panos often, I've already figured out the no parallax point for 16, 20, 24, 28, and 35. Just in case I need to adjust things in the field, I have notes in my iPhone that tell me exactly where those millimeters fall along this nodal slide. But for us, we're going to have to calculate as if it was from scratch. So for this demonstration, I'm going to use 2 light stands, and I'm going to set one up close to the front of the camera and one just a little bit further away. Now, I know everybody doesn't have light stands. If you don't have light stands, you can actually use a door frame, you can use 2 chairs, basically any 2 objects that you can visually see that they're moving at different speeds or at the same speed. So now I've set the camera up at 24 millimeter, and I've set up 2 of the light stands directly in front of my lens, one pretty close and one just a little bit further away. And as you can see, as I move the camera from left to right, in this video, you can see that there's a lot of parallax in this scene. And what I mean by parallax is just that first light stand is moving at a different speed than the light stand in the back. So to calculate the 0 parallax point, or the nodal point for this lens, we need to figure out how much to move this nodal slide to mitigate 100% of that parallax effect. So right now you can see it's easy because it's extremely exaggerated right now. So I know that I need to slide this back just a little bit. So we're going to slide it back a little bit, and we're going to see if it helps. We'll slide it back just a little bit more. That's good. So now that I slid it back about halfway, let's check the parallax again. You can see in the video there's still parallax, but it's getting a little bit better. So since it's getting a little bit better, we know we're going in the right direction. So I'm going to adjust the nodal slide a little bit more. So now, as I start to move side to side, you can see that there's almost zero parallax here. That's exactly what I want to see. So you can see, even with this elaborate setup, before we've calculated the zero parallax point, you could see how much difference there was between the motion of these two light stands. Now imagine if we were standing and doing this handheld, how much parallax there would be there. Photoshop or any stitching software would not be able to piece it together because the objects are actually changing position and changing shape from frame and panel to panel. So now that I've calculated the zero parallax point at 24 millimeter, it'll be easy to adjust it to 18, 20, and even 35 and do the same process. Once I figure out all the points in that lens, I'll just make notes in my phone, and anytime I'm setting up for a shoot, depending on what millimeter I choose, I'll know exactly where to position this nodal slide. So now that we've learned how this system works and how to set it up, let's go use it in the field. Behind me you see Riomaggiore. This is one of the first towns I ever came to and I ever visited, and this is probably one of my very favorite views in the entire region. Today, we're gonna stitch our first pano of this tutorial. So before I get into shooting this pano, I'm gonna do one static normal shot at the max 16 millimeters so you can see everything that I can fit into frame. Now I'm very close to this city in the rocks here, so I feel like the cropping isn't gonna be exactly right. So I'm gonna go ahead and take that shot real quick and we're gonna have a look. So if you look at this frame, it's actually not that bad. We have a good distribution of city, some of the rocks in the foreground, but if you look at the left of the image, you see that I'm actually cutting off that island over there to the left. Now I'd really like to see this image in more of a panoramic format where I have a lot of the water leading into the city and leading into the rocks. So even at 16 millimeter, I still feel like I want a little bit more all around the frame. So anytime that happens, I like to shoot pano images because with this setup, it's really easy to have them stitch 100% perfectly each time, and it's not really that difficult to set up and shoot a few panels and then stitch it together for a greater field of view. Now another thing that comes into play that's a big advantage when shooting panoramic images is right now if I shot one image at 36 megapixel, it's only going to be 36 megapixel. But if I were to shoot a pano here, zoom in and do say a multi-row pano at 50 millimeter, I could easily get this same scene to be close to 100 to 150 megapixel. Now that's perfect if you get hired by a company that wants to produce your work very large in a billboard size or a truck size or anything that's going to be on a huge wall, something that they're going to have to print so large that a normal 36 megapixel file won't cut it. So since I have everything perfectly leveled out, my gimbal, everything's already pre-calculated, I'm going to first rotate the camera into portrait mode and get this all set up to shoot my series of images for the pano. So I have everything set up, tripod's perfectly level, and I'm ready to shoot this pano. Now, every time when I start with a single row pano, I make sure that my horizon is perfectly centered in frame. Then I like to do a test from right to left or left to right to make sure that the camera stays level perfectly the entire time. Since I'm using this gimbal, it has a really convenient node out here where I can test the level and make sure that it's perfect. But sometimes if you get to high extremes on each side, it can start to canter off a little bit. So I just want to make sure that it stays level. Now, as you can see, as I pan through this image from right to left, you can see that the horizon will stay dead center the entire time. Now, this is going to be a single row pano. But if I wanted to do multiple rows, I'd start by shooting the center one like this, then I'd rotate the camera up like this, do an additional row, down like this, and do another additional row. Now for this type of panoramic photography and multiple row panoramic photography, it's always good to start with a baseline in the center horizon first. The reason being is all of your lines and your vertical lines for buildings will be perfectly linear. There won't be any distortion. As you move up and move down, you'll start to get more linear distortion on either side. So if you shoot the horizon first, you'll always have a clean version to work with before you start adding the other rows. I've tested everything, it's perfectly level. I'm using my trigger release here to make sure that I don't disrupt the camera between frames. I want to make sure that everything's perfect without any camera vibration. Since this is a pano image, I'm going to be stitching multiple shots together, so I want to make sure that I maintain consistency throughout the shots. So in order to do this, I've set my white balance to manual and set a custom Kelvin temperature right in the middle, something visually pleasing in my viewfinder. Sometimes setting your custom white balance can seem a little intimidating at first, but what I like to do is I look at the auto white balance first and I try to match it. If everything's good in auto, I switch it over to the custom Kelvin and I set a temperature that visually looks the same. That way, when I shoot these images and put them together in post, they'll have consistent color throughout. It won't change in between frames. Similarly, I've taken the camera out of aperture priority mode and I've set manual mode. So it basically means that I've metered the camera and I've decided on a shutter speed of 1/60 to also maintain that consistency between frames. Now, since the light's going to change a little bit over time, I'm also doing one exposure bracket, one under and the median here, just to make sure that I don't blow out any of the highlights. It's always good to expose for the shadows because it's easier to recover data in the shadows than it is in the highlights. So bracketing with one under assures that I never blow out the highlights because I have my main metering plus one exposure under to compensate just in case I need it. In post, I probably won't need it, but it's always good to have it anyway. So since this is a gold hour shot, I have a few more minutes until the sun gets just low enough on the horizon to cast gold light, a few soft shadows. I don't want to wait too long. If I wait too long, the sun's going to go down too low and I'm not going to get this beautiful golden light. So before that golden light starts, I'm going to make sure that all the shutter speed is correct. In this case, I've decided to use 1/60 because it perfectly and evenly matches every frame that I'm going to capture. 1/60 also works perfectly for these boats, freezes them in motion, and everything's perfect. If we were capturing, let's say, a night scene or a blue hour scene, for example, I'd have to deal with longer exposure times and I might have to bump the ISO up a little bit just to compensate for any motion in the boats. But since there's still plenty of light in the scene, 1/60 is going to be perfect to freeze everything in time. So the light looks perfect right now. The sun's just low enough. There are no clouds on the horizon. I'm getting that perfect, beautiful light that I was looking for. I'm going to go ahead and shoot through this pano sequence. Now, I've already calibrated my camera. I know exactly where the no parallax point is at 24mm. I also know that I want at least a third frame overlap between frames to assure that I'm going to get the most perfect and seamless stitch as possible. Now, when we're shooting single images, it's easy to capture a lighting event because you only have to shoot it one time in a static location. But the more complex your pano is, the farther you zoom in or the more levels that you have to do, the longer it's going to take to run through that sequence. So right now, this takes me about 2.5 minutes to run through the entire sequence. So I know once that light begins to get golden, I want to run through the sequence so I don't run out of light midway through shooting the pano. On my gimbal head here, I actually have degrees of rotation. My favorite at 24mm with this particular setup is 15 degrees. So I'm going to rotate this 15 degrees in between shots to maintain perfect consistency between the frames. Now, as the sun starts to lower in the sky and get closer to the horizon, since I'm in manual mode, I'll have to adjust my exposures to compensate. So I've just ran through the entire pano sequence and I've checked the frame and I feel like I'm underexposing a little bit. So instead of 1/60, I'm going to change it to 1/50 or 1/40 to compensate. So shooting panoramic photography handheld is very difficult because as you pivot your body, there's going to be an incredible amount of parallax throughout the scene. Now, obviously, if you're shooting at something on the distant horizon and there's no parallax, it's a single image plane, then it's easy to just stitch and let the software figure out if you rotate it or anything like that. That should work out pretty well. Though it's always good to use a tripod because you're going to get a more solid frame with less vibration and edge blur just because it's stable when you're shooting. Now, these gimbal heads and calculating the zero parallax point allows you to shoot panos not only in multi-row, but different millimeters as well. Right now, I'm really in a safety zone at 24mm, so I can get away with objects being really close to the camera and far away because it's sort of a medium-wide focal length. But these days, I've seen people stitch even 14mm together like this as long as they're using a gimbal. People can even now stitch fisheye images if they remove the linear distortion before they start stitching the files. So usually my comfort zone with these images is somewhere around 18 to 35 millimeter. I find that no matter what I shoot, as long as I use this pano gimbal setup, I can stitch anything between those millimeter ranges. So this shot really focuses on a 100% gold hour, not a sunset, because a sunset is when the sun is setting, and if the sun sets and moves below the horizon, there's not going to be any beautiful golden light on my foreground elements, and I really want that perfect golden soft light on these buildings. The other reason that I'm shooting a pano is I really want this scene to look like a panoramic image. If I'm standing here and looking from left to right, I want to be able to see the ocean lead the eye into these buildings and create sort of a full panoramic scale image for this scene. The next thing we're going to do is talk about how to stitch these images together in post-processing. Welcome back to the post-processing studio, everybody. This is where we're going to talk about how to stitch together the pano we learned how to do in Riomaggiore. Now remember, this was also where I showed you how to set up a seamless pano by calculating the fixed nodal point. So theoretically, everything that we did, all that preparation we did in camera with our pano gear should result in a seamless and perfect pano. I held out and shot just when the sun just started touching the horizon, so I got beautiful gold light, and I actually ended up with the sun in the frame. So it's really beautiful, and hopefully all that work paid off, and we're going to take a look at how to stitch that together and some different alternatives and different options you can have in the stitching process. So let's go ahead and get started. Again, we're working with Capture One, so you can open up the file associated with this lesson. You can see that I have all of my pano files. If I just select them really quick, I can load them large on the screen, and we can actually see that we have all the way from the right side of the scene all the way to the left. I've managed to keep the sun and that sunburst right in the frame. So it was the perfect last second before that sun dipped below the horizon and the light stopped, or I lost the golden light on the building. So it was a really nice moment. I was able to do it really fast. I was using my Really Right Stuff pano gear and my pano gimbal, so it was really easy to use, really smooth. I was able to just click through these frames one by one, and I was able to check with my millimeter positioning that everything was equally distributed with basic third overlap, which, as you remember from the video, works with pretty much all of our panoramic images. First thing we're going to have to do here in Capture One is change a few things. So let's just go ahead and pick one of these files here. We'll just pick this one all the way here to the left. And what I'm going to do first, you can see the lines are perfect because I leveled the horizon. Everything looks great, but I'm going to go ahead and remove the distortion. And I'm also going to change by removing the light fall off, which is going to be the vignetting. Now I'm going to leave the sharpness fall off by default. I'm not going to change it because I was not shooting at a wide angle. And what I'm going to do is right click on this, copy adjustments, select everything else, right click, and apply adjustments. That's going to apply the same adjustments that I had throughout for this image. Now I'm going to go over to this tab here, and we're going to start by color correcting these images. If we look at them all together, they look pretty good. Everything looks pretty good, but I think I'm going to need to recover a little bit of the shadows. So let's go ahead and work to do that in the first file. So with this first one selected, I can go ahead and increase the shadows, and maybe I pick something around 20% to increase the shadows. Well, as I roll through here, I'm going to do the same thing. So I'm going to increase the shadows about 20%. Now I could copy and paste this, but I'm going to change this as we start to go on, and I'll show you why. After I get into the shadows here, I'm going to leave the shadows with a little bit of recovery right around 20. It's important to be consistent with this because you want everything to stitch seamlessly without any gaps in color or texture or architecture. Now that I've gotten through these, I'm going to leave these alone. I'm going to start looking at these images here. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at the next four. So with the next four, this one looks pretty good. Again, I'm going to go ahead and recover the shadows to about 20. Here's where it gets a little bit interesting. Here, I'm starting to lose a little bit of the highlights. So I'm going to recover the shadows. And I'm also going to recover the highlights just a little bit. And what I'm going to look for is that it's very similar. Maybe 20 here, very similar to this one. So by the time I roll over to this one, I can also do the shadows consistently around 20. But here, instead of 20, I might go up to 30. So I'm basically trying to recover the highlights all the way up into the point where I get to the sun, or I can do something like 35 or 40. So this is the way that I can ramp this, so when I stitch it together, it'll end up being seamless. So here we go with the last two. We know that that was shadows 20, and the highlights were about 30, so I might bring that up to about 40, so I can get that sun just in the frame, or 35 I think worked out pretty well. Last one, 20, consistent, and 30 to 35. I basically just want to bring some of that sun, some of that intensity back into the scene. Everything ready to go here. What I'm going to do that's different, I need to get all of these files into Photoshop. So what I'm going to do is just export them all. And I'm going to right click, export variants. And I'm going to leave it at 16-bit. I'm going to change PSD to a TIFF file. And I'm not going to have it open in Photoshop, but what I'm going to do is just export all of these TIFF files into a separate folder. And now I've already done that. And once that's done, once that runs through with that process, go back to Photoshop, and you can see this is the stitched result that I get. I wanted to show you guys this because you can see it looks really good. But I'm going to run you through the process of actually how I got it to this point. With all of those TIFFs exported, I can go up to File, and go to Automate and Photo Merge. With Photo Merge selected, I can browse to those TIFF files. You can see here's all of those files. I can say Open, and I can go ahead and apply it by saying OK. Now these are all 16-bit, 36 megapixel files. In other words, they're huge. So instead of running through this, it'll take 15 minutes to actually resolve on my computer before I get this result. Rather than doing it, if I were to click OK, I'd end up with this result. The thing is, they'd come in on separate layers, which is no problem. All I've done is taken that panel result and I've flattened it down. And you can see with those same adjustments that I've made, changing the recovery and the highlights and the HDR a little bit over time, you can see that I've been able to create this beautiful, perfect pano. Now, here's really going to be the test to see if it's perfect. Is that horizon level? And look at that, it's pretty much right on the money. And it's pretty much right on the money because I made sure everything was perfectly level. You remember in the video, I went out of my way to make sure that these are perfect every time. So I could shoot these every day, every night, every morning, wherever I was, as long as everything was level. With those settings, you'll be able to get these perfect results. Now, obviously, this one you can see with the cylindrical mapping needs to be cropped down a little bit. So I'll go ahead and crop in the edges. Anything that I feel is distracting, anything like that, we can just crop it in and we can see what our actual true final result is. I'll just say enter here, and we can see that I missed a little bit on the bottom. That tends to happen a little bit. So we can either come in from the bottom or come in from this side, and that is a beautiful pano. Now you can see how easy that was to do. If you plan on doing panos a lot, there are other alternatives. You can do your pano files by doing that same process inside of Photoshop here if you're using Capture One. If you're using Adobe Lightroom, you can do it automatically in Adobe Lightroom, but it's going to give you very few options. But what if you're the type of person who wants to do panos all the time? What if you want to shoot 100 panos when you're on vacation? And what if you're shooting with something that's ridiculous megapixels, 36 to 50 megapixels? In that case, this might not be a good solution to you because you can only do one at a time and you don't get a preview before you get to the final. When you open this up into Photoshop, render it, it could take up to 15 or 20 minutes, and you get a result that either works or doesn't work. So a good solution is to use additional pano software. Now there are some great software applications out there, and when I'm doing a lot of pano work, I really like to use what's called Auto Pano Giga. It's actually a piece of software that's made by a company called Color. They're a French company, and here's the benefit of this. Let's take a look at this again. So basically when you open Auto Pano Giga, it's this empty scene with something on the left and something on the right. I can click on this Browse Folder icon here, and I can actually select that same folder that I had all of those pano files in, and I can say Open and OK. When I click OK, it'll go ahead and auto-analyze that. As you can see, it's brought everything in here, and once it's in here, I can say Automatically Detect, and it'll figure out how to build this pano. It's going to give me all of my shooting settings, everything from the EXIF data all the way to the amount of images, or sometimes even if I've shot multi-row panos. Now this is really great because once I press detect, it's going to build a low-res version preview. There we go. So there's our low-res result. Basically what it does is it takes these files and builds a low-res preview so we can see if we like the pano or if there's any problems before we render it. That's not all, though. This is great because what if I shot multiple panos on this vacation? Now, this was a trip I made with Lee and Patrick from F-Stoppers just for this tutorial, but what if we went to other countries and I shot a bunch of other panos? Well, I can do the same thing and I can preview multiple things in this window. So for this demonstration, I've actually brought in a few more pano examples and I have them inside this folder. All I have to do is select the parent folder and it'll go ahead and auto-detect the subfolders. I can say OK, and you can see here's some other pano files. Well, let's go ahead and detect these too. Let's see what happens. There we go. Now these two in the bottom here are from Santorini. This one's from Petra Jordan. You can see automatically I have a problem with this one, so there's something that I have to resolve. There's some ghosting. These two look pretty good. I actually like these panos. So what if I want to make some adjustments? Now right now I have all of these loaded and all of these previewed. If I like them, I can actually just click on these little render buttons right here. You have a render wheel and you can just render it out. The cool thing is you can change all of the settings. If you double click on any of these, it'll actually open them in a big window, or it'll open in a window that I need to make big, one or the other, depending on the monitor size. And you can see that I get a grid view, I get all these different options, and I can actually change things, actually a lot of different things that I rarely change, from the color correction to the way it's color correcting between all of these images. If there was one that was causing a problem, I could actually go in and just delete that specific image. I could change the color correction here if I wanted to, though I'd never do this inside of this application, I'd do it inside of Photoshop. But very importantly, where Photoshop kind of fails with the pano, it does a beautiful stitch, but it never lets us know what it does. It just does it, and if we like it, we like it. If we don't, we try again. But this is great because if I click on this mapping button, I can actually see that it automatically selected cylindrical, which is okay in this situation, but I can change it to all these other ones. So I can change it to this, or hammer, which sounds awesome, but makes it look a little bit fisheye. This is also where we can do what's called a little planet. So if you shoot a 360-degree panorama and click on little planet, you'll see that I didn't shoot 360 degrees, but it's really cool. Like, this is how people create those really fun tiny planet or little planet effects. Fisheye, orthographic, there's so many different options, and you can see I can do these all on the fly. It's also really nice because let's say that my pano setup wasn't perfect and my horizon wasn't exactly level. It started to bend down a little bit. Well, that's because my setup wasn't correct. But in this case, I can actually move that horizon line. So if it was incorrect, it would look something like this. I'd actually have a slope down. Well, the nice thing about this software is if you end up with this problem, you can reset it yourself, or you can basically just say auto detect and it'll pop right in. So that's really powerful. When I close these windows, I can open any of these up and I can actually take a look. So this one here, you can see that my horizon does start to slope. So if my horizon is starting to slope, I can actually change it a little bit. And I can fix that horizon so the horizon ends up being straight. Very easy to make tiny little adjustments to everything. Cool thing is once I like a pano, let's say it was the one of Riomaggiore, or this one from Santorini in Greece, which is another very beautiful location, we can do the cropping. Once we do the cropping, we crop it all out, and when we're ready to go, we can render it. So I'm able to preview multiple pano files together and then render them if I want. So if I say I like this one, we'll say it's a low-res preview, or actually let's go back to the one that we know is a high-res one with a low-res preview. I can actually click on the render button and I have tons of options. I have options here where I can do it at 100%. It'll tell me that this file at basically at 72 dpi is going to be, or even at 300, dpi doesn't really matter here, it's independent, but basically it's going to be 147 megapixels. That's huge. So 6 meters by 2 meters at 147 megapixels, I can render it down at 50% if I want. I can change this to anti-ghosting where it does an extra pass. I can even change everything here if I want to send it in as a PSD. Very easy to do a PSD. It'll automatically do a PSB if this is over 2 gigs. I could say 16-bit, 300 dpi here, and you can see as I update these things, it'll update here and it'll tell me exactly what the size is at 300 dpi. So this is very powerful. I can say apply. If I apply this, it'll actually create a render queue. So this is really powerful. Right now I'm just using the trial of this software. It is software that you have to purchase, but they offer a free trial as well. So with this, if I've shot 10 panos, I can correct all the issues, do everything that I want, and render these out. So if they're huge, 200 megapixel panos, I can set them all up low res here, set them to render overnight, and it's very powerful. And then once I do that, I can bring them back into Photoshop and make any additional changes that need to happen. This pano file is pretty straightforward, and there are a lot of things that we can do to it in post, changing the color. Basically, everything that we've learned from the first tutorial, landscapes and post-processing, and even what we've learned from lesson 1 in the Manarola Blue Hour. Basically, the standard stuff, the sharpening, contrast, the little things, but the scene was really captured at the most beautiful moment of the sunset. Fortunately, it was kind of a blue sky, but it's still very beautiful, and it's huge. Like it said in that program, it basically ends up being about 130 megapixel at 300 dpi. It's almost ready to be printed as a billboard size, so it's pretty awesome. But rather than going into the color correction and post on this, since it's such a massively big file, I'm just going to encourage you guys to go ahead and export these TIFFs, play around with it, see if you can get the seamless pano to stitch, and then apply a couple effects to it. But I'm going to go ahead and save further editing for the next lesson. So that wraps it up for the panos. Hopefully with a combination of the in-video skills, we taught you how to get seamless panos every time, and now in post-processing I showed you 2 ways to get a seamless stitch and perfect panoramic images.